Day 175, June 24th, Christian Liberty, Conviction, and Love 1, 1 Corinthians 8 verse 1. Knowledge puffeth up, but love edifieth. 1 Corinthians 8 verse 1. Have you ever encountered someone who was puffed up with knowledge? Maybe they were so preoccupied with displaying their knowledge that they hardly took any time to listen to others. Possibly, they had amassed a great amount of head knowledge, yet seemed to lack compassion. What causes this awful malady? How can someone know so much about the Bible, and yet be so high-minded? The answer is found in our verse, knowledge puffeth up, 1 Corinthians 8 verse 1. Essentially, what Paul is saying is that knowledge inflates one's own self-esteem. As a person accumulates more and more information, the pride of life begins to grow. They begin to consider themselves wiser, more intelligent, and greater than others. This overinflated sense of self-worth causes a corresponding contempt for those whom the individual deems less wise, less intelligent, and of less worth than themselves. The more self-absorbed they become, the greater their confidence that they have the right answers. Consequently, they become increasingly close-minded, and do not even consider the possibility that a contrary position could be correct. Becoming proud because of knowledge eventually leads one to a complete inability to learn from others whom they deem to be of lesser worth than themselves. If gaining knowledge causes such terrible pride, does that mean that we should be wary of learning? Should we avoid studying the Bible and simply focus on loving people? Absolutely not. Paul is not teaching us that all learning will lead to pride. In order to understand what he means, let's examine the context. Now, as touching things offered unto idols, we know that we all have knowledge. Knowledge puffeth up, but love edifieth. And if any man think that he knoweth anything, he knoweth nothing yet as he ought to know. But if any man love God, the same is known of him. 1 Corinthians 8 verses 1 to 3. Apparently, a debate had arisen in the Corinthian church over whether or not Christians could eat food that had been offered to idols in pagan temples. Some believed that to do so would be evil, for it seemed to be an endorsement to the worship of false gods. Others, knowing that there were no such things as other gods, had no problem eating the food. Thus, we have a classic case of church conflict based on conflicting convictions, something that has resulted in much discord in countless churches. If we would but take heed to Paul's counsel, many disputes would be ended. Paul begins his argument by reminding the Corinthians that every Christian knows things, but that this knowledge produces pride. It puffs up. It causes some Christians to look down on others who don't know the things they know. In this case, those who knew that there were no other gods were puffed up, having contempt for those who could not eat the food that had been offered to idols. Thus, Paul exposes the evil motives behind those with this knowledge. They were not being contentious because of a love for the truth or out of compassion for their weaker brethren, but from a heart of pride that had been lifted up by their knowledge. They were certainly correct logically, for food which was offered to idols was just food, but they were using that knowledge to bludgeon those who did not have it. Paul reminds them that knowledge is self-inflating, but love builds others up. Notice how Paul affirms that the puffed-up Corinthians, those who felt free to eat, were technically correct from a logical standpoint. As concerning therefore the eating of those things that are offered in sacrifice unto idols, we know that an idol is nothing in the world, and that there is none other God but one. For though there be that are called gods, whether in heaven or in earth, as there be gods many, and lords many, but to us there is but one God, the Father, of whom are all things, and we in him, and one Lord Jesus Christ, by whom are all things, and we by him. 1 Corinthians 8 verses 4 to 6. Paul affirms that their reasoning was not incorrect, but then proceeds to teach them something they don't know. Howbeit there is not in every man that knowledge, for some with conscience of the idol unto this hour eat it as a thing offered unto an idol, and their conscience being weak is defiled. 1 Corinthians 8 verse 7. In other words, Paul is saying that, for those who believe that it is wrong for them. Why is this? To better understand what Paul is saying, we can use a human illustration. Imagine that a father gives his son permission to go to a movie, but the son hears incorrectly, thinking that he has not received permission. For the son, going to the movie would be wrong, because in his mind, he was not given permission. As far as he is concerned, going to the movie would be an act of rebellion, though he had been given permission. The same thing is true in our relationship to God. God is most concerned with the heart, and if we think something is not permitted, then we are disobeying if we do it. Thus, we are given a very important principle that each person must follow their convictions so long as those convictions do not conflict with the direction of Scripture. Those with knowledge in the Corinthian church were so concerned with being correct that they failed to realize the damage which might be done to the conscience of their brethren. Paul warns them of this danger in the following verses. But meat commendeth us not to God, for neither, if we eat, are we the better, neither, if we eat not, are we the worse. But take heed lest by any means this liberty of yours become a stumbling block to them that are weak. 1 Corinthians 8 verses 8-9. In these verses, Paul confronts the Corinthians with yet another fact they apparently don't know, that God is not concerned with whether they eat or don't eat the food, but only that a stumbling block is not placed before his children. Those with knowledge likely supposed that God was on their side of the debate, yet they had more concern for being right than for loving others. They had little concern for the offense they were causing when they ate this food in front of weaker believers. Paul explains this in the next verses. For if any man see thee which hast knowledge sit at meat in the idol's temple, shall not the conscience of him which is weak be emboldened to eat those things which are offered to idols? And through thy knowledge shall the weak brother perish, for whom Christ died. But when ye sin so against the brethren, and wound their weak conscience, ye sin against Christ. 1 Corinthians 8 verses 10-12. As Paul illustrates, those who ate the food offered to idols were emboldening the weaker brethren to do what they thought was wrong, and, by causing their brethren to sin, they were sinning against Christ. With this in mind, notice Paul's conclusion. Wherefore, if meat make my brother to offend, I will eat no flesh while the world standeth, lest I make my brother to offend. 1 Corinthians 8 verse 13. When it comes to these kinds of issues, where conflicts of conscience arise in the church, it is incumbent upon those who have liberty of conscience to lay aside that liberty in love for the weaker brethren. A liberty can be laid down, but a conviction cannot. If we continue reading Paul's explanation into chapter 10, we can see that the stronger brethren must have more concern for the consciences of others than themselves. Paul explains that no believer should be fellowshipping with those who offer food to idols, but they are free to buy any food which is sold in the market. He instructs them not to ask if the food was offered to idols, and this for the sake of conscience. Likewise, he tells them that if they are invited to a feast with unbelievers, they are free to eat, yet they must avoid asking about the food for the sake of conscience. When Paul says not to ask about the food for the sake of conscience, he does not mean that they should ask for the sake of their own conscience, but for the conscience of those around them. If any of them that believe not bid you to a feast, and ye be disposed to go, whatsoever is set before you, eat, asking no question for conscience sake. But if any man say unto you, This is offered in sacrifice unto idols, eat not for his sake that shoot it, and for conscience sake, for the earth is the Lord's, and the fullness thereof. Conscience, I say, not thine own, but of the other. For why is my liberty judged of another man's conscience? For if I by grace be a partaker, why am I evil spoken of for that for which I give thanks? Whether therefore ye eat, or drink, or whatsoever ye do, do all to the glory of God. Give none offense, neither to the Jews, nor to the Gentiles, nor to the church of God, even as I please all men in all things, not seeking mine own profit, but the profit of many, that they may be saved. 1 Corinthians 10 verses 27-33. What was the difference between Paul's edifying knowledge and the Corinthians' puffed up knowledge? The Corinthians used their knowledge to fight for what they wanted, but Paul used his knowledge to build up fellow believers. While they used their knowledge for selfish purposes, Paul used his for selfless purposes. Unlike them, Paul would gladly lay down any liberty which might offend a fellow believer. Though he knew that he had liberty, he would not allow it to be a stumbling block to weaker believers. Having examined Paul's argument, let's return to the paradoxical statement which Paul made at the beginning of the chapter. And if any man think that he knoweth anything, he knoweth nothing yet as he ought to know. But if any man love God, the same is known of him. 1 Corinthians 8 verses 2-3. Notice how Paul sets in contrast the man who thinks he knows with the man who loves God. The man who thinks he knows doesn't know as he ought, but the man who loves God is known by God. When it comes to debates over conflicts of conscience, neither side that fights for its position is right, because neither side knows the real issue as they ought to know. The weaker brethren, those who cannot eat food offered to idols, are wrong because they are judging the brethren who eat, and some are sinning by eating the food against their conscience. The stronger brethren are wrong because they are despising the weaker brethren for not eating. How are they despising them? By placing a stumbling block before them. In conclusion, Paul is not claiming that all knowledge is evil. Rather, he is warning us that as we accumulate knowledge, we can fall into pride, which is contrary to love. The more we think of ourselves, the less we will think of others. Therefore, as we grow in knowledge, we must grow in that knowledge according to love. In many cases, it is far better to lay aside a liberty instead of allowing it to cause division or become a stumbling block. Also, it is often better not to say what we know than to say it, for by saying it, we have more interest in displaying our knowledge than in building others up. Let us examine our hearts, and may we determine to use our knowledge for edification and love. Then, as we walk in love towards our fellow believers, we will know that we are known by God, for our love will be the love of God flowing from our hearts.